Well, we're going to get going since it's 2 o'clock. You guys, this is our last Zoom call. This has really been fun. And we are recording this one, although I don't know how you would ever be able to watch this recording and do a facing. So what I'm doing is I took what I'm presenting here and I put it on to a bunch of pages, and I'll send it all out to you so that you can go step by step through it. But at least I'll be able to comment on some of the things as we go. About what I do and why I chose this particular facing technique. So anyway, well, I'll get started.
Thank you for doing that.
Yes. Well, you're welcome. I've had a lot of people ask me, you know, they're used to doing bindings, but ask me what I do for facing. So I figure there's an interest, and there are, even if you're doing quilts, there are some quilts that just beg a facing rather than a binding. So we can talk a little bit about. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen. I always have trouble figuring out exactly where it is. There it is, right there. All right. So we'll start off with, why consider a facing instead of a binding? Facing a quilt can add a nice, professional, more artful looking finish to your quilt. Those of us who are making art quilts almost always, I would say, choose a facing over a binding, just because we want the quilt to look like it ends the way a canvas would end, or the way that any piece of art would end. The facing allows the piecing of your quilt to float beyond the quilt edge. The same is true of your quilting. It can also float beyond the edge. It's not bound in. When you use a binding, it creates a hard stop frame around the edge of your quilt. And finally, a facing helps to keep your quilt square, hang flatter, and it makes, my favorite part, it makes really nice corners. All right, so I forgot to play this and make it big. So now I'm doing that. Okay, I used a binding on this table runner because I wanted to frame to stop all the activity inside that quilt with a frame around the edge. And I felt that it would accent and kind of hold everything together. So for me, that little black stripe of a binding did what I needed to do. I wanted to stop it, and I wanted it to be framed. But this quilt, my throw, I will probably do a facing, because I don't want a binding. I could use a gray binding. A black binding would definitely be a stopper. But the purple binding, the gray binding would be a softer stop. But I really want that horizontal to go all the way out to the very edge of the quilt and beyond. So I'm pretty sure that this would be, for me anyway, a quilt that I would want to use facing on. So this is an incredibly personal preference. As you look at your quilts, I just want you to have that option. You just never know when it might be, wow, this is definitely a quilt. I just know that a facing is going to look better than a binding. All right, there we go. So to finish your quilt with a facing, step 1, when the quilting is complete, you need to, I'm going to change the way I'm seeing things here. I can't even see all of my, oh, where is it? There. That's weird. All right, I'll just have to remember. When all of your quilting is complete, you trim the finished quilt to square, and adding a 1/4 inch seam allowance around the outside edge. Pretty much the same you do with a binding. Step 2, I really am going to need that. Oh, do you know how I get and how I change what I see here? Do I have to, wait, let me try to escape and change it that way. There we go. All right, that helped. It was cutting off all the words. All of your lovely faces were cutting off all the words, sorry. So you measure the width of your quilt at the center. The reason I do this, it's just the same way you do with a, when you're adding a border. It's just going to make a stronger quilt if you use that center measurement on both ends. And what you're doing at the very beginning here is you are cutting facing strips for the top and the bottom, not the sides. I'll explain later why, but it's really important to start with the top and the bottom. You cut 2 strips of facing fabric, And this fabric can be the same fabric you use for the backing, or it can be a fabric that you want to accent and kind of frame your backing fabric if you really love your backing fabric. Anyway, you cut 2 strips of facing fabric from the lengthwise grain 2 1/4 inches wide by 1 inch shorter than the width of your quilt. I said fabric, but the width of your quilt. So you measured the width of your quilt from the center. So you're going to cut these 2 strips 1 inch shorter than that width. Forget my typo there about fabric. Press under 1/4 inch on one side of each piece of facing, and then sew a line of stitching next to that folded edge on both pieces to finish the facing strip. I've seen a lot of facing tutorials that don't ask you to do that. They leave that unstitched, and you're fooling around with an edge that doesn't stay put. So that side of the facing edge, it looks really nice, it stays put, and it's ready to do your hem stitch all the way around. So does anybody have any questions so far? So one thing I do want to mention is why I'm saying the lengthwise grain of your fabric. The lengthwise grain stops any kind of stretching. So if the most important thing is to keep your quilt absolutely square, then use the lengthwise grain for your facing. If you're putting it on, now I have had a child's quilt that had a lot of stripes across it, and I really decided to do a facing for that one because there's always tugging, there's always all kinds of dragging and whatever that goes on with a child's quilt. I used the crosswise grain of the fabric so that it would stretch a little bit with the tugging. But if you're doing something that is like a table runner or like a wall hanging, an art quilt, or a quilt like a throw that isn't going to get a lot of stretching, maybe, you could use the lengthwise grain of your fabric and really be assured that you're going to keep the super square of your quilt. You press under 1/4 inch on each side of each piece of facing. I already did this. Never mind. Let me keep going. Okay. So now you're going to sew the facing strips to the top and bottom of your quilt. With right sides together, you pin the raw edge of the facing strips to the edge of your quilt on the top and the bottom, making sure the facing strip is placed exactly 1/2 inch from the quilt corners. And that again is to make sure that your quilt is square. If you pin those just like you would a border that you've measured from the center, you're going to make sure that those exact measurements keep that quilt really square. Sew the facing strips to the quilt with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and I use a walking foot in this area because there's a lot of bulk there. Press the facing toward the seam allowance, and you can use steam for this. I use a damp pressing cloth because I can get more control with a damp pressing cloth, and I don't have to worry about stretching either the seam allowance or the facing when I use a damp pressing cloth. It just holds everything in place, and you get to put a lot of weight and a lot of steam right into that seam allowance. Again, any questions as we go along here? Okay, a lot of quiet. Okay. Then you top stitch the facing strips to the seam allowance. Any of you have ever done some garment sewing? Whenever you do a collar and you turn the edge of a collar or you turn the edge of a cuff, they always have you top stitch or stay stitch the edge of the facing right next to the seam allowance. And what that does is reinforce that edge. And you're going to see why this is really important as we go along. And certainly if you actually make one of these facings, you will discover very quickly how easy that makes turning it, how you can get a really knife edge because you've got that stay stitching there. So with the right side up, you sew through the facing and the seam allowance about 1 inch away from the seam.
Are you doing any kind of trimming at all?
Nope.
Of batting?
You trimmed the quilt to square at the very beginning. So it's all trimmed down to exactly the size of your finished quilt, all square, plus a 1/4 inch seam allowance all the way around.
Right.
So
But I
there
mean,
shouldn't be any batting that you would have to pull out of there.
well, I know sometimes the battings that I use when I'm doing like a facing, that the the batting that's in that seam, sometimes I want to just trim that out again, like you would in a garment when you're doing like a neckline and you want the least amount of bulk that you can possibly have. Sometimes I'll take and very, very carefully just trim out some of that excess batting. It just reduces bulk in that seam area.
I have never done that. I will have to try that and see if I like it better. I can understand why you would do it. What I see it doing is moving the edge of the bulk in so that it's a little closer to the seam on the outside. Done. Let's talk about this again and see if it might be a really, really good idea to try this. Try what you're saying. I've never done it.
It depends on how dense the quilt is quilted also.
Sure.
You know, if it's super dense quilt, you're not going to probably be able to do it successfully without taking the chance of cutting into one of those seams.
Right.
But if it's fairly loose at the edge, I find that it just really reduces bulk, just enough to make a slight but major difference.
Interesting. Okay. Well, I'm definitely going to try that. So now you measure the length of your quilt again at the center. So this time you're going right down the center of the long from the sides. You want it basically, you're measuring the length of the sides, but you're measuring it at the center. You cut 2 strips of facing fabric from the lengthwise grain, 2 1/4 inches wide and 2 inches longer than the length of your quilt, not your fabric. They made that same typo again. I cut and paste. Press under 1/4 inch on one side of each piece of facing and sew a line of stitching next to the folded edge on both pieces to finish your facing strips. So you're doing exactly the same thing that you did for the top and bottom. You're doing that now for the sides.
Except this one's longer.
Except this one, well, I guess it depends. If the sides are like, if it's a landscape, then the sides are shorter and the top and the bottom are longer.
Well, but your strip is 2 inches longer on the top and bottom. You had us cut it a 1/2 inch shorter.
Correct.
So this one is longer.
That's what you're talking about. Yes, true. That is true. And that's because it's going to be the one that folds over and makes the corner. I cannot read what that says. Is there any way I can move that up or down? At any rate, put the facing strips to the sides of your quilt. So the next thing you're going to do is sew the facing strips to the side of your quilt. Make sure the facing strip extends exactly 1 inch beyond the quilt corners. Again, really measure this because that measurement is a huge part of keeping everything really square. Sew the facing strips to the quilt with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Press the facing strip toward the seam allowance. Set the seam with steam or a pressing cloth. And top stitch the facing to the seam allowance 1/8 inch from the seam. So you're doing exactly what you did before. Now, the next thing you're going to do is you're going to fold the top and bottom facings to the back of your quilt. And you're rolling, excuse me, you're rolling the fold so the seam only shows on the back of your quilt. This picture, I found this picture, and it's better than even the pictures I was taking of the quilt I was taking pictures of, because I loved how you can really see that that seam is rolled. I don't do it to this degree because I don't want to deal with that in the corners, but you do want to roll it. And then at this point, I pin and I baste that fold because I want that fold to be a knife edge. And the only way I seem to be able to do that is to baste it and then take my damp pressing cloth and really, really, with, a cotton setting and a lot of pressure, I go along and really make that a knife edge at the edge of my quilt. at the top and bottom and the sides of my quilt. Once you're sure it's really down and it's really well pressed, then you pin and hand stitch the top and the bottom of the facing to the back of your quilt. So the edge that you've shown, this particular one does not show that the facing is sewn right along that folded edge. But anyway, you take that folded edge and you're going to stitch that to the back of the quilt with just a tack hand stitching, the same way that you would sew the back of your binding to the quilt. The top and the bottom facings are now completely finished. So we're moving on to the sides. Fold the side facings to the back of your quilt, rolling the fold so the seam only shows on the back of your quilt. Again, pin and baste that fold. Remove the pins and press the fold with steam or a damp pressing cloth to firmly set the fold. And then remove all of the basting stitches around the entire quilt. So now we're going to talk about finishing the corners. And the reason I have you start with the top and bottom is because these final folds that come around the corners, come around the sides. When you look at the quilt if someone should see your quilt from the side of the quilt, all they see is this final fold. They don't see any overlap. They don't see anything. There's no possible way they can see it because all that's there is the final fold. On the top and the bottom is where there's a tiny little bit of overlap. And a lot of quilts that they started with the sides, and you can see that little bit of overlap that kind of pushes the quilt out just a little bit on the back. So by starting with top and bottom, you have a really super clean finish. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
It does. Good. Okay. So on the back of the quilt, you fold over those ends, those 1-inch tabs of the side facings at a slight inward angle. And then you fold the whole facing over to create the corner. Just pin that a little bit, press it, and check from the front to make sure that your corner is really nice and square and that the facing is not visible from the front. If it's not quite right, this is an easy time to refold, press again until those corners are square and the facing is not visible. Then to finish the corners, you open it back up again, you trim the extended raw edge of each facing strip to about a third of an inch, just to get rid of that excess. And then finally, you finish the facing. So on this picture, again, was a little bit better than my picture. This first picture, where it shows you how you're turning that tab of the facing so it goes at kind of an inward angle. And then you're trimming that facing off. And now you're folding the whole facing over to the rolled line that you've pressed, and you're pinning it in place. And that's what the final picture there is, how it should look when you're ready to pin and stitch. So then you pin the complete stitch, the complete facing, and to the back of your quilt, and you hand stitch it. So this is such an easy facing. I've seen things where you're sewing pieces together, where you're sewing arcs. I mean, oh my gosh, some of these, and a lot of them have turned points, which are just, for me, I'll get 3 great points and then one that's really cockeyed. So I tried to get away from turned points, and this has been my favorite facing. I've done a lot of quilts with this one, and they've always come through for me. So does anybody have any questions?
So how would you sew a sleeve on that?
Well, you just ignore it basically, and you do the same kind of thing as you do with the binding, only you can really decide where you want to attach the top. So normally if you have a binding, you attach it right at the edge of the binding. In this case, you measure yourself about a ½ inch down, or 3/4 of an inch down, or 5/8 of an inch down, and you decide that's where your binding's going to be. I mean, your sleeve is going to go.
Okay, good, thank you.
You're just using your ruler to set that line.
Right.
Yeah. Good question. Any other questions?
I would think that that would make it a little challenging to secure the sleeve so that you're going into both the facing and the backing of the fabric, but not getting into the front. Because I know I have real challenges sometimes in that when I'm attaching my sleeve, my stitches sometimes go to the front. So I have to check like every 2 or 3 stitches to make sure that that stitch hasn't gotten all the way through, because I want that sleeve to have some substance, that it's not just being attached to the facing.
So how is it different than when you're attaching it right under the binding? Are you attaching it to the binding?
No, I'm below the binding. So I'm going right into the backing, the quilted backing.
Right.
So if you have the facing, that's on top of your backing. So
Right.
when you're trying to put the sleeve on, you're going to have to go through the facing as well as into the backing, so
I
that
see what you're saying.
you have some, you're getting into some meat, that sleeve is actually holding onto something other than just the facing, because that facing is going to want to pull up.
Yeah, I would have to say that I just did this in order to create some pictures here. And I did put a sleeve on the quilt. And I would have to say that probably I had 2 or 3 stitches in a row that only went through the facing, and then I tucked down and make sure I picked up that backing, and 2 or 3 stitches that didn't, and then go down and pick up that backing. So I understand what you're saying, and I did compensate that way. I didn't have any stitches that, I mean, I didn't have problems. Maybe it's the batting I'm using with going through the front, but there's certainly some battings that I would have that issue. I'd have to really watch.
It's something to point out.
Yeah, yeah.
One thing that I find when I'm trying to do a blind stitch like that is to have my finger right underneath where I'm running the thread through, and you can actually feel the thread
Right,
if it's come through the front side.
right.
But usually I figure that out after I've already made the stitch, and then I have to go through and pull it out and then rethread it, which that's the part that annoys me the most, is the rethreading of the stupid frickin' needle.
Mhm.
Yes, I agree. Definitely agree.
So here, maybe I'm doing sleeves all wrong, but when I put a sleeve on a quilt that it has a binding, I sew the top of the sleeve in with the, oh, good. So maybe I'm not doing it all wrong.
No,
In
I
with
think a lot of
the
people do that.
seam, yeah, and then fold the binding over that seam.
Right.
So the sleeve just is, okay, good. I'm glad to hear that. I thought maybe I was
No.
But
being a newbie kind of person here.
something
Anyway.
to keep in mind, though, when you do that, when you're hanging that quilt, you're putting pressure on that seam.
Mm-hmm.
So if you bring it down, then your pressure is on where you're stitching it below that binding. So your
Instead of the
binding
binding.
is not getting that additional stress. And that can actually, depending on the weight of your quilt, that can tilt that binding forward.
Really? Huh.
Yeah, because that seam is under pressure.
Sure.
And so it can tilt your binding forward.
So when you put your sleeve on in the manner that you're talking about, you're sewing it on by hand, right?
Correct.
Okay.
And it's really important to keep that line straight.
Right. Oh, yeah.
Whatever
bet.
you've measured it down. And it should be down at least 1/4 of an inch below, because when you get a fat rod in it, you don't want
Right.
that sleeve to come up past your binding and,
Right.
and have your sleeve show beyond your quilt.
Hmm.
So that's another reason to put it a little bit below.
Below. Yeah. Good. Thank
Speaking
you.
of which, I learned a trick from one of my other quilters from San Luis, and I just tried it on my challenge quilt. is what she does is when she's making her sleeve, she actually runs a 1/4 of an inch stitch, a basting stitch on her sewing machine on the visible part of the sleeve, and then she can sew it on completely flat. And once the sleeve is completely on, then she takes out that basting stitch. And so you have the perfect amount of fullness that you need for that sleeve.
Hmm.
And so you're not having to kind of guess, am I straight? Am I straight? Am I straight?
Mm-hmm.
That's a
Good
good one.
idea.
I tried it and I thought, and she's a pretty crafty gal. And I tried it and it really made putting that sleeve on so much simpler. So
Good. Well, there are as many ideas as there are people out there on how to put on a sleeve, how to put on a facing. You can't believe all the different ways to put on a facing. I'm still finding new ways to do bindings, even with some of the great ideas people have about binding. So, you know, this is all good stuff to keep trying.
There's no perfect way. It's all,
perfect way.
Whatever
Nope,
works
sure.
for you.
So does anybody else have questions or ideas or things, sleeves, facings, anything else before we move on to Wonky? Hey, Wonky. Okay. So does anybody have anything to share with Wonky?
I made some squares. First of all, I like the paper piece. So I did the paper piecing rather than cutting out all the separate sections. I tried one with the separate pieces and it drove me crazy. So I switched to paper piecing.
That's great.
And that worked a lot better for me. I'm okay with my trees. They came out pretty well.
They did.
I think I'm going to start over and do one with a dark background, though. I'm not wild about this background. And I do not like my house at all because I used too light a fabric for the house and there's no contrast.
It is cute though, but I agree. A darker fabric would make it really pop off the background.
Yeah. It hides in there in the background. So it's a work in progress, but like I say, I'll probably start over and use a dark background because I kind of prefer that look.
So what did you copy the pattern? What did you copy the pattern on to do your paper piecing?
I use the freezer paper piecing where you fold it back and you actually stitch next to the freezer paper instead of on the paper. Cool. I learned that method a long time ago and it works easily for me and it works with my brain. So
that's great.
Yeah.
Yeah, I learned that through one class I took, and it changed paper piecing for me. It made it better.
It really is easy. Yeah.
Yeah, a lot better.
Well, and Kathleen, because I hate paper piecing, I used the freezer paper and it made a pattern and I sewed them together without the paper.
Oh.
And as long as you do it one step at a time, it worked great.
That's great. Wow. So you must be really good at matching corners.
No, but it's working.
That's awesome.
And it's wonky.
No paper at all.
That's what I love about it. It's wonky, and so what?
So we want to see one of these.
Well, this is the one that I did. Let's see.
Oh, cute.
Oh, it's so cute. It turned out
great. So easy. Yeah.
Turned out great.
Simple. Yeah. Paper piecing to me is like, I don't get it.
I'm the same way.
You're really good at inch, at adding that 1/4 inch because you're sewing directly relying on that 1/4 inch. So that's awesome.
Yeah.
That's very cool.
Thank you.
Okay, anybody else?
Is that the only one you have, Susan?
Yeah, that's the only one I have. I just did.
Oh, good.
I have the tombstone.
Oh boy. Oh, I
Oh,
love
I
it.
love it.
Can you see
I
it?
love
Yes,
With the skeletons.
the skeletons are
That is-
amazing.
Awesome.
They're not a lot of contrast, but I still like the skeletons.
I think they look, well, they really stand out. They look great. I
Yeah.
love all the wild fabrics you used for the sky. That's very cool. That looks really cool.
Yeah, I did all the tops with the bats, so they all look like it's darker in the top. So
That's great.
I'm happy with it.
Cool.
It's been fun.
I love it. Love it. Well, Jenny,
I had put mine on the Facebook page.
oh, I haven't seen it.
So
Cute.
there's
Ooh, I like the
That is
plaid.
cute.
the back.
That looks
I'm
great. Ginger.
doing some trees are orange, some are purple, some are
Love
green.
it.
And then I had a lot of fun with the house. So
Oh, that's cute.
Cute.
That
That,
looks so cool. That's
let's
great.
see, like that.
Yeah.
And the tombstones.
Oh, look at your
Oh, very cute.
tombstones. That
Nice.
turned out wonderful.
This has been a lot of fun.
I
Yeah.
know, that's so great. I'm glad you're having a good time. So Jenny, do you want to hold yours up and see if we can see it?
I'll see I'll see how it works. I don't know. I'm not having very good luck with my screen, but we'll see what we can do.
Okay.
All right, let's see. Is it showing at all?
Just
but
hold it up
back
a little higher.
Back up.
Higher?
There you go.
Back
And
up.
back up a little bit.
Okay.
Okay, there you go. Now we
Right
can
there.
see.
And raise it up a
Okay.
little bit.
There you
Perfect.
go. Now we see it. That really looks cute. I love all your fabrics you've got in there and the bats and the trees. That's so cool. Oh, look at all the glowing windows of your house.
Oh, I love your witch.
Yeah, the witch and the tombstones look great. How fun. That's wonderful.
Quilted.
Jenny was one of my pattern testers at the very beginning before she was the one who caught some of the mistakes I made on my patterns. Somebody should have gone through my tutorial today and caught my fabric versus quilts.
All
There
good.
weren't very many mistakes. I thought it was a lot of fun to put it together, and it was a different kind of paper piecing than I had done before. So I did use your method on all of it, and I enjoyed it.
Good, good. I'm so glad. That's awesome. Well, cool. I guess we've seen everything everybody's done.
I've got.
I have one.
Oh, you
I
have one,
have
Cheryl.
one.
Yay.
Here's my house. Can you see it?
Yes.
I love it.
Wow. Oh, you got cool stuff in the windows.
I
Yeah, and
love
I put
That's
it.
cool.
I do not,
Very
this is
fun.
applique on there. This is fussy cut. This is applique.
Very fun. What do
And
you have on the
here's one
door?
of my trees.
Oh, that's cool.
Nice.
Yeah.
You used a little orange right at the top. That's fun.
Yeah, yeah.
What's on the door of your house?
It says, do not enter.
That's fun. And a purple
Yeah.
door.
Yep, yep,
Very cool.
yep.
Well,
This
you
is
guys,
my-
this has really been a lot of fun. Oh,
This
and
is
you
my
got one.
newest tree.
Yay.
Oh, cute.
Ooh, I like that background.
And you
The
can-
background is so cool.
This is going to be for my daughter-in-law, and this I don't know if you can tell. God, it's so hard to get this arranged. It's a house that says bats.
Oh,
and
yeah.
My daughter-in-law is very much into bats.
Ah.
Nice.
Oh, and then I have my two.
Oh, look at that.
Oh, I like that.
That turned out great.
That's good. Yeah.
That's my
Yeah.
favorite house. I love that house.
And then my other house.
Very cute.
Whoops.
I love this purple background. That's really fun.
It's very fun. It has tombstones and witches' hats and brooms and stars and bats and ravens and pumpkins. I don't know if there's.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, fun.
So it's
Great
been a
print.
very good background because it's dark without being black, so it's a little bit softer. And then here's some of my other trees.
Oh, that's
Mm.
fun.
This is one of my favorite trees.
I like that.
Here's another one.
Oh, I love these orange ones. They're really great.
And a green one. Now remember, I'm doing 2 of
You're
these.
doing too, yeah.
Mhm.
And my last tree.
Very cool.
Mm.
These turned out great, Smitty.
Coming
Really
along.
I have a question, Kathleen.
Yeah.
I'm going to make mine into a wall hanging. And
Mhm.
I think you had an example somewhere.
do?
Did I see one?
What I'll do is I'll send it to you because I don't know if
Okay.
I'm too good about going in there and finding it.
Finding, yeah.
But I can send it. I can send it to you. And
Okay.
it's just a bunch of blocks I kind of virtually put together. It's not a real wall hanging. It's
Okay.
just blocks that I put together to show what a wall hanging would look like.
Yeah, that's kind of, I just need some idea.
Sure. I'll send it off.
Okay.
Yeah. I'm
Thanks.
happy to
That's
do
what
that.
I'm going to be doing. One of mine is going to be a table runner. One of mine is going to be a wall hanging. Well, actually, it'll be a table topper. She can use it as a wall hanging or as a table topper. My guess is she'll use it as a table topper.
Sure. Yeah. That'd be great. Sounds like fun.
So
Fun,
it's got to
fun
be
gift to
big
get.
enough, but not too big.
Yeah. Fun. Okay, everybody. Unless we have
Thank you.
something else.
Thank you.
Thank you
Thank
very
you so
much.
much.
Thank you,
so
Kathleen.
much. This is great.
Thank you, Kathleen.
It's been fun.
You're welcome. I'm sorry to see this end because I'm having a great time seeing what everybody's doing. But be sure if you get them in a quilt show, this quilt show or the next quilt show or Blossom Fest next year, be sure and show them off so I can see how you finished them up. That would be just awesome.